The future maniac and cannibal Albert Fish was born in Washington in 1870. His father, Randall Fish, a fertilizer salesman, turned 75 that year. He was 43 years older than Albert's mother. The maniac had two brothers and a sister, but he was the youngest. Much later, psychiatrists and researchers would argue that all members of the Fish family suffered from various mental disorders. Most likely, when making absentee diagnoses, scientists tried to find the most realistic, from their point of view, explanation of what turns an ordinary person into a bloody monster. In any case, reliable evidence of the Fish's mental abnormalities was never presented. At birth, the future maniac received the name Hamilton. When he was 5 years old, his father Randall Fish died on the street from a heart attack. The Fishes didn't have much savings, and Hamilton's mother was forced to give him to a shelter. There he received a nickname consonant with his name. He could not get rid of it for a very long time, which is why he disliked the name given to him at birth. Also, while in the shelter, Fish realized that he took pleasure in pain. In those days, many shelters in America practiced physical punishment in the form of spanking. During the punishments, and then the assault, little Fish got an erection. For an 8-year-old boy, this is unusual and served as an additional incentive to bully Fish. 4 years later, in 1879, Albert's mother was able to get a government job and took her son. But the experience in the shelter forever changed the future monster. He was only 12 years old when he entered into a same-sex relationship with a postman boy who delivered telegrams. Around the same time, Fish began visiting public baths, where he could freely view naked men. He was especially attracted to boys, aged 7 to 12. In 1890, Fish moved to New York. Immediately after the move, he changed the name Hamilton, which he hated, to Albert. He later said that he moved to become a prostitute. Whether he realized his plans is unknown. But it was possible to establish that after his arrival he began to regularly force young boys to perform acts. The maniac chose his victims among street children, of whom there were a lot on the streets of New York at that time. They did not try to report it to the police, and therefore the police were not aware of Fish's art. However, Albert's mother suspected something and decided to urgently marry her son. In 1898, Albert married a 19-year-old girl chosen by his mother. From this marriage Fish had 6 children, 4 sons and 2 girls. But he continued to hunt for children. In 1903, the maniac was caught stealing from a warehouse, where he worked as either a loader or a storekeeper. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and sent to the famous Sing Sing prison. Albert was very popular in prison. In those days, men with unconventional views still tried not to advertise their preferences. Therefore, hardened prisoners, who had not seen a woman for decades, had to take advantage of weaker cellmates. And there's no need to force it, Albert was always in favor. After leaving prison in 1905, Fish became quiet for a while. Or maybe he didn't calm down. In those days there was no global information technology, and therefore no one found out about some crimes. He committed his first deprivation of life, which Fish is charged with, in 1910. The victim was Thomas Bedden from Delaware, who was 10. The next massacre occurred 9 years later. Fish, according to police, took the life of a mentally retarded boy in Virginia with a knife. The monster committed a new crime 5 years later. On July 14, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald disappeared. The boy's friends said that he left with an elderly, thin man with a gray mustache. The police began searching for the gray man, one of Fish's nicknames given to him by the police because of the color of his coat. But in those days, the police had no experience in investigating such unmotivated crimes, and the investigation led nowhere. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney disappeared. Gaffney's 3-year-old friend, also Billy, witnessed the abduction. He said that a strange man approached them while they were playing near the house. "Why, strange. He was so fabulous, not scary at all," the boy said. The witness also described the criminal's gray mustache, which he even allowed to touch. There is no doubt that today's police officers would cling to their gray mustaches and be able to connect these clarifications. But the experience of the then police officers took its toll. The maniac committed the most famous kidnapping and deprivation of life in June 1928. 18-year-old Edward Budd placed an advertisement in a newspaper looking for work in a rural area and indicated his address. That's where 58-year-old Fish came. It is quite possible that he wanted to kidnap the young man. However, when he arrived, he saw Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace. And his plans changed. He spent several hours with the Budds, promised to hire Edward, and left. He returned, as promised, in a couple of days. He told Edward to pack his things and he would come pick him up later. And while Edward is getting ready, Fish, he introduced himself as Farmer Frank Howard and convinced Grace's parents to let her go with him to the holiday. Like, his niece, who lives not very far away, has a birthday. The trusting Budds let the girl go and never saw her again. By the way, 2 years after Grace's disappearance, the police arrested a certain Charles Edward Pope. His wife reported to the police that it was he who kidnapped the girl. Pope was jailed for 4 months. But his guilt could not be proven at trial. But it turned out that Pope was going to divorce his wife and even moved out of the shared apartment. And 6.5 years after Grace disappeared, in November 1934, her mother Delia received an anonymous letter. This letter, which the maniac sent, became the most famous of all the messages of criminals. The executioner outlined 2 shocking details in his message. This is what the letter said: "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, my friend sailed as a sailor on the steamship Tacoma under the command of Captain John Davis. From San Francisco they sailed to Hong Kong, China. On arrival my friend and 2 other sailors went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the ship had already left. There was a famine in China at that time. Meat of any kind cost from $1 to $3 per pound. Since the poor suffered the most, all children under 12 were sold for food in order to save the elders from starvation. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe on the street. You could walk into any store and ask for a steak, and they would cook it for you. You would be given pieces of the body of a boy or a girl if you only wanted a cut of such meat. The butt of a boy or girl is the most delicious part of the body. It was sold at the highest price. A friend who stayed there acquired a taste for human flesh. Upon returning to New York, he captured 2 boys 7 and 11 years old. Hiding them in his remote home, he kept them tied up in the closet. Several times a day he spanked them to make the meat tastier. He first took the life of an 11-year-old boy because he was fatter and had more meat. The smaller boy repeated this path. At that time I lived at 409 East 100th Street. A friend told me so often about the taste of human flesh that I decided to try it in order to form my own opinion. On Sunday, June 3, 1928, I addressed you at 406 West 15th Street. I brought you a basket of strawberries. We had breakfast. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I decided to eat it. I offered to take her to the holiday. You said, yes, she can go. I took her to an empty house in Bestchester that I had chosen in advance. When we got there, I told her to stay outside. She collected wild flowers. I went upstairs and took off all my clothes. I knew that if I started doing what I intended, I would stain her with blood. When everything was ready, I went to the window and called her. I then hid in the toilet until she entered the room. When she saw me without clothes, she screamed and tried to run up the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said that she would tell her mom everything. First I took off all her clothes. How she kicked, bit and tore. I strangled her and then cut out the soft parts to take to my rooms, cook and eat. It took me 9 days to completely eat her meat. I didn't use it for sexual purposes, although I could have if I wanted. The maniac later told his lawyer that he had taken advantage of Grace, but the police did not confirm this statement. In general, as psychiatrists noted, Fish was simply a pathological liar. Grace's parents did not believe in the reality of what the maniac described. They thought that someone was playing a stupid and terrible joke on them. but the letter was still delivered to the police and fell into the hands of the chief investigator, William King. The policeman didn't think it was a prank. He also immediately noticed that the letter was sealed in a branded envelope. The hexagonal emblem of the New York Teamsters Private Benevolent Association was clearly recognizable on the envelope. Such envelopes were produced not in millions, but in small batches. King ordered a thorough survey of all employees of the organization regarding the misuse of envelopes. The doorman admitted that he took several envelopes for his own needs. However, he did not have time to use them all. "I forgot a few in the room I recently moved out of." The owner of the room said that after this doorman, the room was rented by an elderly, thin man with a gray mustache. She also said that the guest receives money from his son. Having moved out a few days ago, he did not receive the latest transfer and must come for it. King decided to personally meet the suspicious grandfather. In those days there were no special forces, and the police sometimes went alone to arrest criminals. That's what King did. Albert Fish, as soon as the investigator introduced himself and offered to go with him, attacked King with 2 straight razors in his hands. But the policeman tied up the maniac and took him to headquarters. There, the monster immediately admitted to taking Grace's life, and the girl's mother and brother identified him. But the police decided to check Fish for other disappearances. His photograph was published in the newspaper. And soon the trolleybus controller contacted the police and identified Fish as the man who was traveling in his vehicle with a little boy on February 11, 1927. The witness stated that he remembered the strange couple because the boy was without a jacket, crying and constantly calling for his mother. It was the day Bill Gaffney disappeared, whose body was never found. The boy's mother turned directly to the maniac and asked him to tell about his son and Fish to tell everything as it happened. "He told me how he mocked him and how he ate him for 4 days." After Grace's mother's letter, most psychiatrists began to declare that Albert Fish was insane and could not be tried. Apparently, this was precisely the verdict that the maniac sought when he described his exploits. The criminal also claimed that he deeply believed in God. And even when he ate his victims and drank their blood, he was simply performing a ritual. But although psychiatrists were inclined to think of insanity, Fish still appeared before the jury. It is quite possible that this was a political decision. One way or another, on March 11, 1935, a trial began that found Fish's involvement in 3 lives. The police accused him of 15, and the criminal himself confessed to 498. The trial ended 10 days later with a death sentence. After listening to him, the maniac exclaimed, "What a delight, to die in the electric chair. This will be the highest pleasure, the only one that I have not yet experienced." He really was a masochist and did not exaggerate at all that he enjoyed pain. When on January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was chained to the electric chair in the Sing Sing prison he was already familiar with, they could not immediately pass the current through his body. The switch had to be turned on twice before the doctor declared death. The reason was revealed during the autopsy. It turned out that Fish had inserted several dozen needles into his own body. 27 of them were found in the groin area alone. This metal prevented the normal flow of electric current. But this same metal brought unbearable suffering to Fish. It seems that the maniac received full pleasure from the double execution.